The prisoner and the soldier. The first thing Sergeant Daniel Reeves noticed when he woke up was the cold metal floor beneath him. His head pounded, and his body ached as if he had been hit by a truck. The air smelled strange, like burned metal and something rotten. He blinked a few times, trying to focus, but the dim red lights in the room didn't help. He wasn't in his bunk. He wasn't on his ship. Then it hit him. The ambush. The firefight. The gas. He had been captured. Daniel pushed himself up, groaning. His wrists were sore, and when he looked down, he saw metal cuffs around them. They weren't locked, but they had left deep bruises, meaning he had been restrained before being dumped here. As his vision cleared, he took in his surroundings. The walls were made of some dull, gray metal, and the floor had deep scratches, as if something big had been dragged across it. A single bed, if it could even be called that, was pressed against the far wall. Just a thin slab of metal with a small, dirty cushion on top. And then he saw it. In the corner, just beyond the bed, something huge moved. Daniel tensed, his heart hammering in his chest. He forced himself not to react, not to show fear. Whatever it was, it had been watching him since he woke up. A pair of glowing yellow eyes stared at him from the shadows. Then the creature leaned forward, stepping slightly into the light. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark blue scales, with thick, muscular arms that ended in sharp claws. Its jaw was wide, with rows of sharp teeth, and 2 short, curved horns protruded from its head. It was an alien, and it was smirking at him. Then, to Daniel's utter confusion, the creature spoke. "That bed looks better than mine. Scoot over." Daniel froze. Of all the things he expected, a growl, a threat, maybe even an attack, this was not it. The alien pointed at the tiny bed and then at the cold floor where it was sitting. Its deep voice rumbled through the small cell. Daniel stared for a moment, trying to figure out if he had hit his head too hard. "You're joking," he finally said. The alien gave a slow shrug. "I do not joke. That is a luxury bed. I demand equal treatment." Daniel let out a sharp breath, rubbing his face. This had to be some kind of dream. He had been captured by aliens, locked in a cell, and now he was having a conversation with one. "Right," he muttered. "And who are you exactly?" The alien leaned back against the wall, his massive arms resting on his knees. "Guruk, son of Corvish, leader of the Draken elite." Daniel's stomach dropped. Draken. He knew that name. They were warriors, famous across the galaxy for hunting humans and fighting in brutal wars. Great. He was stuck in a cell with a human-eating space lizard. He shifted slightly, keeping his eyes on Guruk. "And why are you in here? Shouldn't you be out killing people?" Guruk let out a deep chuckle. "I was betrayed." Daniel frowned. "My people turned against me," Guruk continued. "Now I am here. And so are you." Daniel wasn't sure what to make of that. If Guruk was telling the truth, then he wasn't his biggest problem. Still, that didn't mean he trusted him. Daniel looked around again, trying to spot a way out. There was a heavy metal door on the far side of the room, with a small red panel next to it. No visible locks, no buttons. "Escape?" Guruk asked, watching him. Daniel sighed. "Yeah, that's the idea." Guruk gave a slow nod. "Good. I do not wish to rot in this place either." There was a long silence between them. Daniel finally sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. This was insane. He needed to think. Where was he? Who captured him? And more importantly, what did they want? Before he could process it, a loud buzzing sound echoed through the cell. Daniel shot to his feet, his instincts kicking in. The door slid open. 2 figures stood in the doorway. One was a guard, a tall, armored alien with dark, insect-like features. The other was a human, but not just any human. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was Commander Hale, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Terran military. And he was smirking. "Welcome to your new home, Sergeant," Hale said. "I hope you like it." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a prison. This was something much worse. Unlikely allies. Daniel's blood ran cold as he stared at Commander Hale. The man standing in the doorway was supposed to be a hero, a leader in the Terran military. He had commanded fleets, led soldiers into battle, and given speeches about human unity against alien threats. And yet here he was, standing beside an alien guard, looking smug. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Why are you here?" Hale stepped forward, his boots clicking against the metal floor. "That's the wrong question, Sergeant," he said smoothly. "The real question is, why are you here?" Daniel's gut twisted. Something was very wrong. Gurik shifted beside him, muscles tensing. His yellow eyes flicked from Hale to the insectoid guard, analyzing, preparing. Even he could sense the danger. Hale sighed, tilting his head. "You always were a fighter, Reeves. That's what makes this so much fun." The insectoid guard hissed, stepping forward, holding some sort of metal baton. Before Daniel could react, the alien swung it forward, a sharp electric crackling sound filling the air. A blinding pain shot through Daniel's body. He hit the ground, his muscles spasming, his breath caught in his throat. The electric shock left his vision blurry, his ears ringing. Through the haze, he heard Hale chuckle. "I'd love to explain everything to you, but where's the fun in that?" Hale said. He turned to the guard. "Take him to testing. And as for the big one," he glanced at Gurik. "He stays put." The last thing Daniel saw before his vision went black was Gurik's furious expression, and the alien lunging forward just as the guards activated a second shock device. Then, darkness. Daniel wakes up, again. Pain. A deep burning pain in his shoulder, arms, and legs. Daniel groaned, blinking against the harsh white light above him. He wasn't in the cell anymore. This was a laboratory. The walls were smooth and silver, the air cold and sterile. He was strapped to a metal examination table, thick bands holding his wrists and ankles in place. Voices murmured nearby. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear machines humming, the sound of liquid bubbling in tubes, and the occasional beep of monitors. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. He needed to think, to observe. He turned his head slightly. There were 3 figures in the room. 2 of them were scientists, 1 human, 1 an alien with gray skin and 6 fingers. The third, Hale. The commander stood behind a large control panel, adjusting some settings. His expression was amused, like he was watching a game. Daniel's stomach twisted. "You should have stayed unconscious," Hale said casually, looking up. "Things are about to get interesting." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Why are you doing this?" Hale smirked. "Because I can." He pressed a button on the console. Immediately, searing pain exploded in Daniel's head. His vision blurred, his muscles tensed, his heart pounded against his chest. His body felt like it was on fire, every nerve screaming at once. He gasped, struggling, but the restraints held him in place. It wasn't just pain, it was something deeper. A strange pressure in his skull, like something was trying to unlock a part of his mind that had never been touched before. The scientists watched, taking notes. Hale leaned forward. "You see, Sergeant, you're special. More special than you know." Daniel gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Go to hell," he growled. Hale only laughed. "Oh, you'll wish you were there soon enough." The pressure in Daniel's head intensified. And then, a shockwave erupted from his body. The machines flickered, sparks burst from the console, and the alien scientist stumbled backward, shouting in its strange, clicking language. Hale's smirk vanished. Daniel panted, his body tingling, his restraints still holding. But he felt different, like something inside him had changed. Something had awakened, and Hale knew it. He narrowed his eyes. Well, that's interesting. Daniel didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just an ordinary prisoner anymore. Meanwhile, back in the cell, Hurek sat on the cold floor, staring at the door. His claws flexed, his tail flicked. He had been in battles, he had fought wars, he had led armies. But never had he felt this kind of anger before. They had taken the human. And that meant trouble was coming. The moment that door opened, someone was going to die. Where is the human? The guard gurgled, his legs kicking in the air. Gurek tightened his grip. Where? The guard pointed down the hall, gasping. Gurek threw him aside and took off running. Daniel had saved his life once before. Now, it was time to return the favor. The escape collides. Daniel sprinted through the facility, his stolen weapon clutched tightly in his hands. His new abilities, whatever they were keeping him upright, but he could feel his strength draining. He needed to find a way out. A voice crackled through the speakers overhead. Security breach detected. All units engage. Daniel cursed. They were closing in. Then, a massive crash sounded from the hallway ahead. Daniel skidded to a stop, raising his weapon, and saw Gurek burst through the wall. The massive alien landed in the corridor, covered in dust and debris, his claws gleaming, his chest heaving. The two locked eyes. Gurek smirked. Ah, there you are. Before Daniel could respond, more guards flooded the hallway, weapons raised. Gurek turned, cracking his neck. I suggest we kill them quickly. Daniel exhaled, lifting his rifle. For once, I agree with you. The guards opened fire, and the fight for their freedom began. The betrayal. The corridor erupted in gunfire. Daniel dove to the side, his instincts taking over as bright energy bolts streaked past his head. The air smelled like burning metal and ozone, the walls scorching black where the shots hit. Gurek, however, didn't bother dodging. With a thunderous roar, the massive alien charged straight at the guards, his claws slicing through the air. The first soldier barely had time to react before Gurek's massive fist slammed into his chest, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening crunch. The second managed to fire a shot, but Gurek didn't stop. The plasma round sizzled against his armored scales, but he grabbed the soldier's rifle with one hand, lifted the man into the air, and snapped the weapon in half with his bare hands. Daniel didn't waste time watching. He rolled to his feet and returned fire, taking down two more guards with precise shots. Within seconds, the hallway fell silent, the guards motionless on the ground. Daniel exhaled, gripping his rifle. Well, that wasn't subtle. Gurek snorted, flicking blood from his claws. Subtlety is for cowards. Daniel shook his head. He didn't have time to argue. They needed to move. Fast. Which way? Gurek asked, cracking his neck. Daniel glanced at the overhead lights, noticing the flickering red emergency signs. This way, he said, pointing down a corridor. If I'm right, we're near the main hangar. We get there. We steal a ship. We get out. Gurek grinned. A simple plan. Let's hope it works. The two took off running. The labyrinth of the facility. The deeper they went, the more chaotic the facility became. Alarms blared, red warning lights flashing in every corridor. Automated turrets swiveled from the ceiling, forcing them to dive behind cover as more soldiers flooded the halls. Daniel covered Gurek's flank, taking down enemies with well-placed shots. His new abilities made his reflexes sharper, his aim deadlier. But something still felt off. As they ran past a control room, Daniel caught a glimpse of security footage on a large screen. His breath caught in his throat. There were other prisoners, dozens of them, humans, aliens, creatures he didn't even recognize, locked in cages. Some were unconscious, Others were screaming as guards dragged them away. Daniel stopped. Gurik noticed and growled. "We do not have time for this, human." Daniel's fists clenched. "We can't just leave them." Gurik exhaled sharply, glancing at the screen. His tail flicked. "This is not our fight." Daniel glared at him. "Maybe not yours, but it's mine." Without waiting, he turned and sprinted toward the prison wing. Gurik groaned. "Foolish human." But after a moment, he cursed under his breath and followed. The prisoners. The detention block was worse than Daniel expected. Rows of cryopods lined the walls, each one containing a prisoner in stasis. Strange tubes pumped chemicals into their bodies, keeping them in a dreamless sleep. A control panel at the center of the room flashed with alien symbols. Daniel stepped forward, examining the interface. "I can override the locks." Gurik folded his arms. "Then do it." Daniel's fingers flew over the controls. The system was complex, but his training kicked in. After a few tense seconds, the cryopods released with a hiss. One by one, the prisoners collapsed onto the floor, coughing and gasping for air. Daniel stepped forward, helping a young woman to her feet. She had cybernetic implants along her arms and a terrified expression. Who are you?" she stammered. "Someone who's getting you out of here," Daniel said firmly. But before he could say more, a familiar voice rang out behind him. Touching, but foolish. Daniel's heart stopped. He turned slowly and came face to face with Commander Hale. The betrayal. Hale stood at the doorway, flanked by elite guards in dark armor. His smirk was mocking, his hands casually folded behind his back. "Always the hero, Reeves," Hale said, shaking his head. "That's your biggest weakness." Daniel gritted his teeth. "You're a traitor, Hale." Hale laughed. "Oh, come on. Traitor is such an ugly word. Let's just say I evolved past outdated loyalties." Gurik snarled. "You sold your own people." Hale shrugged. "No, I simply picked the winning side." Then his expression darkened. "But you had to mess everything up." He motioned to the guards. "Kill them all." The room erupted into chaos. The battle for freedom. Daniel dove behind cover as the guards opened fire. Energy blasts scorched the walls, narrowly missing the prisoners. Gurik charged forward, slamming a soldier against the wall with bone-crushing force. The freed prisoners, though weak and disoriented, began fighting back, grabbing weapons from fallen guards. Daniel took out 2 soldiers with precise headshots, ducking behind a console as return fire whizzed past his head. Then he spotted Hale slipping away through a side exit. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Oh no, not this time." He reloaded his rifle, locking onto his target. "Gurik, handle things here," he shouted. Without waiting for a reply, he took off after Hale. The chase. Hale ran down the corridor, his long coat whipping behind him. Daniel pushed himself faster, his enhanced speed making his steps feel lighter. Hale reached a locked door and quickly tapped a security code. But just before it could close, Daniel slammed into him, tackling him to the ground. Hale grunted, trying to push Daniel off, but Daniel pinned him down. "You're not going anywhere," Daniel growled. Hale chuckled breathlessly. "Oh, I disagree." Then he pressed something on his wrist. Daniel barely had time to react before an explosion rocked the facility. The walls shook violently, and Daniel was thrown backward. As the dust settled, Daniel coughed, trying to push himself up. But Hale was gone. The smoke cleared just enough for Daniel to see a small escape shuttle rising from the hangar bay below. Hale's voice crackled over the intercom. "This isn't over, Sergeant." Daniel's jaw tightened as the shuttle disappeared into space. Damn it. But there was no time to dwell. He turned back and saw Gurik standing at the corridor entrance, covered in blood but victorious. "Is he dead?" Gurik asked. Daniel exhaled. "Not yet, but I'll make sure he will be." Gurik smirked. Good. Behind them, the freed prisoners stood, waiting. The facility continued shaking. The self-destruct sequence activated. Daniel took a deep breath. They had won this fight. But the war was just beginning. The great breakout. The walls shook violently, alarms blaring through the facility as the self-destruct sequence counted down. 10 minutes until detonation. Daniel wiped the dust from his face, his heart pounding. Around him, the freed prisoners coughed and stumbled, disoriented from the battle, and whatever experiments had been done to them. Some were barely able to stand. Others had the same look in their eyes that Daniel did: rage, determination, and the will to survive. "We need to move," he shouted over the noise. Kirk snorted, standing tall, his massive frame covered in blood and burns. "Your species is always in a hurry." Daniel shot him a glare. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not explode, if it's all the same to you." Kirk chuckled, but his yellow eyes scanned the room carefully. He knew the danger was real. Daniel turned to the prisoners. "Can anyone fly a ship?" A tall woman stepped forward. Her skin was pale blue, and glowing circuit-like veins ran along her arms. "I can," she said, her voice slightly metallic. "If we get to the hangar." Daniel nodded. "Good. Let's move." The maze of fire and metal. The corridors were a war zone. Fire burst from broken pipes, sending thick black smoke into the air. The ground rumbled beneath them, and metal beams collapsed from the ceiling. Security wasn't entirely gone. As they ran through the facility, remnants of Hale's soldiers launched a desperate last stand. Daniel barely dodged a plasma round as a group of heavily armed guards blocked their path. "Take cover," he yelled, pulling a weak prisoner behind a crate just as bullets tore into the walls. Kirk, however, had other plans. With a feral roar, he charged straight into the gunfire. The guards panicked, unloading their weapons into him, but their shots barely slowed him down. He smashed into the first soldier, slamming him against the wall so hard his armor cracked like glass. The second tried to raise his rifle, but Kirk grabbed it midair, snapping it in half before lifting the soldier and throwing him across the hallway like a ragdoll. The third guard turned to run. But Daniel was already there. He grabbed the man by the back of his armor and slammed him face first into a console, knocking him out cold. Silence. Daniel exhaled. The remaining prisoners stared at them, some in awe, some in fear. "Keep moving," he ordered. The hangar, their only way out. They burst into the hangar, and Daniel felt his stomach drop. It was chaos. The hangar was massive, filled with enemy warships, but the escape wasn't going to be easy. More soldiers swarmed the area, blocking access to the ships. Turrets whirred to life, locking onto them. And worse, a colossal battle mech stood at the center of the hangar, its glowing red visor locking onto Daniel's group. It lifted a massive cannon and aimed. "Get down," Daniel yelled. A deafening explosion ripped through the air. The blast tore through the floor, sending debris flying. 2 prisoners were vaporized instantly. Daniel coughed through the smoke, his ears ringing. That thing was a walking death machine. "We can't fight that thing head-on," Daniel muttered. "We need to split up." Kirk grinned, cracking his massive knuckles. "You distract. I destroy." Daniel hesitated. "You sure?" Kirk's tail flicked, his muscles coiling like a predator ready to strike. "I have waited too long to kill something big." Daniel smirked. "All right. Go nuts." The fight against the mech. Kirk roared, launching himself forward with terrifying speed. The mech locked onto him, its massive cannon rotating. But Kirk was faster. He leaped onto the machine, his claws sinking deep into its metal armor. With inhuman strength, he ripped a panel off, exposing the inner wiring. The mech shook violently, trying to throw him off. Daniel used the distraction to sprint toward the nearest warship, firing shots at the remaining ground troops. "Get that ship ready." he shouted at the blue-skinned pilot. She was already working, her hands moving over the controls. Almost there. Behind them, Gurek tore deeper into the mech, ripping out chunks of metal and wires. Sparks flew, the machine stumbling as its systems failed. It tried one last desperate attack, raising its arm to crush him. But Gurek grabbed it mid-swing. With a monstrous snarl, he used every ounce of his strength and ripped the entire arm off the mech, sending it crashing to the ground. The remaining guards fled in terror. Daniel turned to the prisoners. Everyone aboard. Now. The final countdown. 1 minute until detonation. The ship's engines roared to life, the hangar doors opening just in time. Daniel jumped into the cockpit, watching as prisoners rushed inside. Gurek was the last aboard, leaping in just as the ship began to rise off the ground. The hangar collapsed behind them, fire and debris swallowing the facility whole. Daniel gripped the controls. Punch it. The blue-skinned pilot slammed the thrusters forward, and the ship blasted out of the hangar at full speed, barely outrunning the shockwave as the entire facility erupted into a massive explosion. The aftermath. As the ship reached open space, Daniel finally exhaled. They had made it. They had escaped. The freed prisoners sat in stunned silence, some crying, some laughing. Daniel turned to Gurek, who was covered in burns and bruises, but grinning like a madman. The alien rumbled. That was fun. Daniel shook his head. You have a weird idea of fun. Then his expression darkened. Hale had escaped, and Daniel knew this wasn't over. He clenched his fists. We need to find out what the hell they were doing in that facility, he muttered. We need to stop this. Gurek smirked. And here I thought we were done. Daniel stared out into space, his mind racing. This was only the beginning. The final battle. The stars stretched endlessly outside the warship's viewport, but Daniel wasn't looking at them. He stood near the cockpit, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. Hale had escaped. Even after everything, the battles, the betrayals, the near-death escape, the man was still out there. And that meant one thing. This wasn't over. Behind him, the ship's cargo bay was filled with freed prisoners, some tending to their wounds, others murmuring in confusion or fear. Daniel exhaled, turning to Gurek. We can't let him get away. The massive alien snorted, his yellow eyes gleaming. I was hoping you'd say that. Hale's warship, the hunt begins. Daniel and Gurek stood in the command center of their stolen ship, surrounded by screens flashing holographic star maps. The blue-skinned pilot, Tara, tapped a glowing interface. I managed to track his escape route, she said. He's headed toward the Zareth system. If we move fast, we can catch him. Daniel nodded, his mind racing. The Zareth system was on the edge of known space, a perfect hideout, remote, dangerous, and full of black market warlords. If Hale was going there, it meant he had a plan. And Daniel wasn't about to let him execute it. We need to move now, he said. Tara hesitated. This ship isn't made for battle. Daniel turned to Gurek. Think we can handle it? Gurek grinned, baring his fangs. I say we crush him. That was good enough for Daniel. Set course, he ordered. We end this. The ambush at Zareth. When they arrived in the Zareth system, the moment they dropped out of warp, alarms blared. Enemy ships. A fleet of heavily armed vessels surrounded them. Daniel's stomach twisted. It was a trap. Tara's voice was tense. Hale knew we were coming. Daniel gritted his teeth. Then we fight. The enemy warships opened fire. The space battle. The entire ship shook violently as energy blasts rained down on them. Daniel grabbed the edge of a console, his knuckles white. Evasive maneuvers. Tara pushed the thrusters to max, dodging between enemy ships as plasma fire tore through space. Gurek stormed into the weapons bay, his claws curling around the turret controls. Let's see how these cowards handle some real firepower. The ship's cannons roared. sending a hailstorm of energy rounds into the enemy fleet. One enemy fighter exploded instantly, another spiraling out of control. But there were too many of them. "We're not going to win this in a firefight," Daniel muttered. He scanned the battlefield and saw Hale's warship. It was larger than the others, shielded, heavily armed, but not invincible. Daniel's mind raced. He turned to Guruk. "We need to board that ship." Guruk's eyes widened in delight. "Now you're speaking my language." The boarding assault. Dodging enemy fire, Daniel and Guruk launched themselves toward Hale's warship in a stolen assault pod, blasting toward the hull at high speed. The pod crashed into the ship, metal screeching as it drilled into the outer layer. Daniel braced himself. "Ready?" Guruk grinned. "Always." The pod's door blasted open, and they stormed into the enemy ship. Instantly, alarms blared. Troops rushed toward them, but Guruk was already moving. The first soldier never stood a chance. Guruk's claws tore through his armor, sending him crumpling to the ground. Daniel took cover, firing precise shots that dropped enemy after enemy. They pushed forward, storming the corridors, cutting down resistance as they moved toward the command center. And then, they reached Hale's chamber. The final confrontation. The doors slid open. Hale stood in the center of the room, waiting for them. But he wasn't alone. A massive suit of mechanized exo-armor covered his body, twice the size of a normal man, glowing with alien tech enhancements. His smirk was gone. "I expected you, Sergeant." His voice echoed through the chamber, metallic and cold. "But you've already lost." Daniel raised his weapon. "We'll see about that." Hale lunged forward, his mechanized arm slamming into the ground, sending a shockwave through the room. Daniel rolled to the side, firing shots, but the bullets barely dented the armor. Guruk roared, charging straight at Hale. But the exo-armor was fast. Hale grabbed Guruk mid-charge and threw him across the room, sending the massive alien crashing into a wall. Daniel's heart pounded. Hale was too strong. And then, Daniel felt it. That energy inside him, the one from the experiments, the one that had been growing since his escape. It was awakening. His veins burned, his vision sharpened. Power exploded through his body. Hale paused, his red visor scanning Daniel. "What?" Daniel moved faster than he ever had before. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, he was slamming his fist into Hale's armor, sending him flying. The force of the impact shattered metal, and Hale crashed against the control panel. Daniel didn't stop. He grabbed the enemy commander by the throat, his grip unnaturally strong. Hale choked, struggling. "What are you?" Daniel's eyes glowed faintly. "I'm done playing your game." With one final push, he threw Hale into the ship's power core. There was a moment of silence. Then, the entire ship began to overload. Escape before destruction. Guruk pulled himself up, shaking off the pain. "What did you do?" Daniel grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the escape pods. "We need to leave. Now." The ship shook violently, sparks flying from every console. Alarms blared. Self-destruct initiated. They sprinted through the corridors, dodging falling debris and collapsing walls. Daniel's lungs burned, his muscles screaming. But they made it. The escape pod doors hissed open, and the moment they leaped inside, the warship exploded behind them, erupting into a fireball in space. The escape pod shot away at full speed, just in time to see the wreckage disappear into the void. Daniel leaned back, catching his breath. Guruk laughed, a deep, satisfied rumble. Now that was a fight. Daniel smirked. Hale was gone. But the war was just beginning. The final stand. The escape pod drifted through space, the wreckage of Hale's warship still burning in the void behind them. Daniel sat against the pod's cold metal wall, his breath heavy, his muscles aching. Every part of him felt like he had been through hell and back. And he had. Kirk sat across from him, his massive frame taking up half the pod's space, his deep yellow eyes glowing in the dark interior. Despite the injuries and burns covering his body, the alien looked amused. "That was a glorious battle," Kirk rumbled. "Your species may be weaker than mine, but you fight well." Daniel chuckled dryly. "I'll take that as a compliment." Their moment of peace didn't last. Tara's voice crackled over the pod's communicator. "Reeves." "Kirk, do you copy?" Daniel grabbed the radio. "We're alive." "Barely." "We're picking you up now," Tara replied. "But you better brace yourselves. We've got a problem." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What now?" There was a pause. Then Tara's voice came through again, grim. "The Terran fleet just arrived." The arrival of the Terran fleet. The escape pod's viewports darkened as massive warships descended from hyperspace, their hulls gleaming under the cold light of the distant sun. It was the full might of humanity's military. Dozens of ships, some as large as cities, bristling with weapons powerful enough to wipe out entire planets. Daniel's pulse quickened. If they had come to rescue him, why wasn't he relieved? The pod shuddered as it was pulled into Tara's stolen warship. The doors hissed open, and Daniel rushed to the bridge, only to be met with dozens of freed prisoners staring at the view screen in fear. The Terran fleet had surrounded them, and at the center of the formation, the dreadnought Invictus. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. That was Admiral Graves' ship, the highest-ranking military officer in the Terran fleet. And if Graves was here, this wasn't a rescue mission. This was a containment mission, a dangerous broadcast. The main view screen crackled to life. A stern, silver-haired man in a dark military uniform appeared. Admiral Graves. His face was unreadable, his cold blue eyes locked onto Daniel's ship like a predator watching prey. "Sergeant Reeves." Daniel straightened his stance, despite the bruises covering his body. "Admiral." Graves exhaled slowly. "You and your companion will power down your weapons and surrender immediately." Kirk snorted, folding his arms. "I do not surrender." Daniel ignored him. "With all due respect, Admiral, we just risked our lives destroying a secret human experiment facility and taking down a traitor." Graves didn't blink. "And that's exactly why you need to stand down." Daniel's stomach turned. They weren't being rescued. They were being silenced. Kirk tensed, sensing the shift. "They want to kill you, human." Daniel's mind raced. The experiments, the prisoners, Hale's betrayals, it was all connected. And the Terran government didn't want it getting out. Daniel's fists clenched. They had survived everything, only to be erased by their own people. Not today. The standoff. Tara turned to Daniel. "We can't fight them." Daniel knew she was right. They were in a stolen enemy warship, barely operational, against an entire armada. If they ran, they'd be hunted. If they fought, they'd be annihilated. His only chance. The truth. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped toward the ship's main comm system. He pressed a button, activating an open broadcast, not just to the Terran fleet, but to every unencrypted frequency in the system. If Graves wanted this secret buried, Daniel would make sure the whole galaxy heard it first. "This is Sergeant Daniel Reeves of the Terran military." His voice was steady, unwavering. "I have proof that our government has been conducting illegal genetic experiments on prisoners, human and alien alike. They were creating something unnatural, and they tried to kill me to keep it quiet." Admiral Graves' expression darkened. "Reeves, shut that transmission down." Daniel didn't stop. "They turned people into weapons. They murdered innocents. They tried to break me, but I survived. And I won't let them cover it up." Across the fleet, signals flashed as the broadcast spread. On civilian channels, on pirate networks, even in the heart of the Terran capital. Daniel could see it happening in real time. The truth was out. Graves' cold mask finally cracked. You have no idea what you've done. Daniel exhaled. Oh, I do. The turning point. For a long, tense moment, silence. Then, a second fleet dropped out of warp. Not Terran, not hostile, but a fleet of independent warships, mercenaries, and rebel forces, answering the call. Daniel's message had reached the right ears, and they weren't here to surrender. A gruff voice came over the comms. Sergeant Reeves, this is Captain Valen of the Free Star Alliance. Heard your little distress call. Thought we'd even the odds. Daniel's pulse spiked. Graves looked genuinely furious for the first time. You don't know what you're interfering with. Captain Valen chuckled. Oh, we do. And we don't like it. The standoff was broken. Graves had lost control. Daniel saw the hesitation ripple through the Terran fleet, some captains, some soldiers, wondering if they were on the wrong side of history. And then, Graves made the call. All ships, fall back. The Terran fleet withdrew, vanishing into hyperspace. And just like that, Daniel had won. The aftermath. The war begins. Daniel sat on the bridge, watching as the stars passed by. Herrick dropped into the seat next to him. So, what now? Daniel leaned back, his muscles finally relaxing. We just declared war on the most powerful force in the galaxy. Herrick grinned. Good. I was getting bored. Daniel smirked. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were rebels. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt free.